Good evening and welcome to the Force of Freedom podcast on the Seeds of Liberty Network. You can find all of our content at theseedsofliberty.com. Also on Facebook, Stitcher, iTunes, and Twitter. I'm Donnie. Once again, Lloyd, still moving, just got his internet back. So tonight we have Timothy Judge and Adrian Parks. Adrian is the owner of the Voluntarist Ministry page on Facebook. And if you guys want to, Adrian, go ahead and start and just give a brief intro of yourself.
Well, I'm a former U.S. Marine, former active duty, 6 years active duty. I served in Desert Shield, Desert Storm, where I saw combat about 2 weeks after the ceasefire in Kuwait in 1991. Had a profound impact on me, and it kind of changed my way of thinking from the statist ideology I had going into the Marine Corps to where I couldn't wait to get out. Since then, I've sorted some things out, gone through my cognitive dissonance stage, and realized I'm a voluntarist. Now I'm an ordained minister. I run the voluntarist ministry, and we are expanding greatly. So that's basically what I do, is I preach voluntarism from a Taoist point of view.
All right. Tim, go ahead and tell us about yourself.
Well, I'm Timothy Judge. Everyone calls me Tim. So I was in the Navy, the nuclear Navy, for 6 years. And it was really in the Navy that I first started to realize that the government wasn't really what I had always been told it was. But I didn't really fully make that transition into voluntarism. I was just kind of a general libertarian until, I don't know, probably about 2 years ago. But yeah, my experience in the Navy really did start me on that path with realizing what just how crazy things were to be in the government, and how none of it really seemed to make any sense. And the government, even in the military, which everyone thinks of as kind of, this paragon of efficiency and virtue or something for some reason, that even there, everything was backwards. Nothing worked the way you would in a rational way. And so now I'm currently working on a degree in history, and that takes up most of my time. I do occasional freelance art, which has very little to do with voluntarism, but now I'm here to talk about Iran and all sorts of stuff.
Okay, so I guess we'll kind of get just a brief overview. Iran has been if you're an American and you don't hate Iran, you're probably a voluntarist, because for my entire lifetime they've been on the shit list of every propagandized ridiculous headline you can imagine. And I don't know exactly what year the economic sanctions start, but they've been in place for quite a long time. And economic sanctions in and of themselves are an act of war. Anybody tried to do this to America, I mean, how long before we invaded anybody who put economic sanctions on us?
Well, that's an interesting question, because Brazil threatened to at one point. And they threatened to ban all business with the U.S. while the U.S. was subsidizing U.S. cotton farms, and they were suing us in the World Trade Organization? Yeah, the WTO, the World Trade Organization. And so, in that case, the U.S. backed down and basically just subsidized Brazilian cotton farmers. But right, so
and that's
right now
what's known as a solution.
right now, your tax money, if you're listening in the U.S., part of it goes to Brazilian cotton farmers. But yeah, I really do think that if a major trade partner like, say, China had just said, nope, no more trading with the U.S., we won't buy any of their quote-unquote sovereign debt, yeah, I mean, the U.S. would go to war with us. Part of the reason that Japan attacked in Pearl Harbor was that the U.S. had long-standing sanctions against certain kinds of business in Japan. And yeah, it's the idea that these sanctions, that in some cases, like in Iraq, the sanctions there killed, according to the UN, which, I mean, okay, it's a pretty statist organization, but the U.S. didn't contest these numbers. They said that 500,000 children died of preventable medical conditions because of sanctions in Iraq. And the U.S. is like, yeah, that's fine. If even, like, 1,000 American children had died because of Iran, everyone in America would be calling for the blood of all Iranians. They would want to glass the entire
Yep.
Iranian plateau. I mean, it would be crazy.
Yep. And that's really the point about economic sanctions is it hurts all of the people, which don't necessarily care, because it's really more a government versus government conflict. So
Right.
so that the common Iranian feels the pinch, but not the people that are supposed to feel the pinch.
Yeah, they don't care. If you're a mullah in Iran, I mean, you can go fly off to France and get whatever you want. It's not a
Yep.
big deal.
Yep. So a lot of their the talk is about this Iranian nuclear deal, which the U.S. is screaming, U.S. and especially Israel, always screaming about an Iranian nuclear weapon. And for two countries that have nuclear weapons, trying to proliferate or non-proliferate and enforce that really just makes when Iran goes hot and says we have a nuclear weapon, all it says is we're invasion proof now. So now all those things that you used to do to twist our arm and put us into compliance with threats of war, and we're still threatening war. There's Republican presidential candidates saying, you put me in the Oval Office and we're going to war with Iran. All options on the table, as they like to so nicely call it.
Oh,
But as soon as Iran says, hey, we have a nuke, now all of a sudden they're invasion proof. There's no way that they can get invaded by America, and America knows it.
yeah.
I find it funny when we talk about nuclear weapons. I find it extremely funny, and not in a ha ha way, but I think it's odd that the one country in the world who has used nuclear weapons like we did in World War II is the one screaming about others finally having them.
Oh
You
yeah.
know, we're the ones that dropped the bomb, not once, but
Yep.
twice.
Yep.
Right.
And,
And
and who are we to say who can and cannot have these things?
Mm-hmm.
It's not like we learned our lesson and did away with them. We
Yep.
continue to build our arsenal. And
Yep.
who are we to say that you can't have them just because we do?
Yep.
It doesn't make any sense.
Did Iran debase our currency? Did Iran turn our public school system into the point where you get nothing but mindless zombies after 13 years of it? Did they start any foreign wars?
like
They're
maybe
not the ones
two.
doing any of this.
Yeah.
They're not.
Yeah. Two in the last 1,500 years.
Basically, yeah. I mean, it's 14, but yeah, basically.
I'm sorry, I was close.
It's
So
it's all right. 7th century. That was basically when they ended their war with the Romans because, well, the Arabs started a war with them that the Arabs won.
right. Well,
Which
and
is
I think it just illuminates that the U.S. is really running out of options. The way the federal government operates this country, it's essentially it's always looking for another economic fix. It's trying to keep the people from revolting, and so far it's doing successfully because they keep managing to keep the dollar alive. And everything that we see on the world stage, all the way back to the first Gulf War, if not farther back, all of these things are just keeping the petrodollar paradigm in good standing. Because the minute that goes sideways, this is all going to get ugly.
yeah. Well, that not long before the bombing in Libya, Gaddafi had started to say that, well, maybe we want to take non-dollar currencies, and the same thing had happened with Iraq. They had said, well, we're willing to take euros for our oil, and I mean, is there hard proof that that's why the invasions had to happen? Well, no, but it's it's interesting that whenever it seems like a country says, well, maybe this whole taking dollars for oil is unnecessary, and we could start pegging our oil to metals or to euros or something. Although why you'd peg it to the euro is beyond me, but still.
Yeah, I mean, I guess it's not a science to point out somebody else's motivations, but at a certain point, it walks like a duck and it quacks like a duck.
Right.
So
Right. And before the whole Libya thing, like, who had heard of Muammar Gaddafi? I mean, I might have heard the name, But until we started bombing, and by we, I guess I mean the United States, I should stop saying we, but it's a hard habit to break after so many years. Until the United States started bombing them, I didn't know who he was.
Well, I mean, they bombed him back in the 80s. Reagan was the first person to hit Gaddafi. Killed one of his wives and one of his kids.
But
and
in
then
the 80s,
whatever.
I was in diapers, so...
Yeah, right. I'm saying it's a lot longer standing thing with Libya, but that guy, I mean, think what you want about Gaddafi. His people, I mean, his country was fairly well run. It was kind of a socialist nightmare, but at the same time, it was a socialist nightmare that functioned, unlike Venezuela or Greece, where,
right.
I mean, he managed to make it work. And for as socialist as some of the policies in Libya were, he was interested in backing his money with gold. And he was trying to do that. And that's a very strange move for a socialist. And I think he kind of recognized being a dictator, being the guy who's in charge because he killed enough people. He didn't want to lose that. And he understood that socialism at a certain point is going to shit the bed. And he can only do so much. So he had to take some kind of measures to correct it. Because when you don't, it looks like Greece.
Well, I think one thing I'll say that I think really applies to the Middle East to a large extent, and including places like Iran and Afghanistan, which aren't the Middle East but are often lumped in there, is that socialism, the way we think of it, is not it's not a terribly strong force. There's kind of waning pan-Arab nationalism in a lot of places, which the Ba'athist Party is to some degree an outgrowth of. Then we've got kind of the military strongman governments, of which Gaddafi was an example, which don't really have so much of an ideology as they do, like, we're just going to do what it takes to stay in power and keep our buddies rich. And then we've also got the Islamist groups like ISIS, and in the Shia camp, we've also got Iran. And to be fair, their government is a Shia Islamist government. I'm not going to pretend it's not. So I think that socialism, the way we think of it, like it occurs in places like democratic socialist countries in Europe or socialist countries in Latin America, is not really a force to the same degree in the Middle East.
Roger. Yeah, I mean, to a certain extent, and there's a lot of good arguments for a monarchy over socialism.
Oh, yeah.
Because
I prefer a monarchy.
Yeah, somebody's got to pass that on to their kids, and it's got to be somewhat maintained, as opposed to the 4-year sprints that go on in D.C., where people are like, well, I might not be here for years now, so let's do everything I can, and it doesn't matter if I have to sell my grandkids' kidneys to do it. I'm going to stay here and now, of course, for the greater good. It's always for the greater good. No, there is no pile of bodies too large for the greater good.
Yeah, the term limits really increase time preference. They really shorten it to a huge degree. You say, okay, if I'm going to be able to be in office for a maximum of 8 years, I want these 8 years to go great, and I do not care at all about year 9.
Number 9. Yep.
Right, year 9, it does not matter at all to me. And, okay, maybe it does a little bit if you're like, oh, I want my party to stay in power, but that usually doesn't happen anyway, so who cares?
Yeah, that's a far off second. Second place.
Although I do feel like we're starting to drift a little bit from Iran. Maybe we should bring it back to Iran. And one of the things about Iran is this current deal that everyone's up in arms about, and by everyone I really mean like the neocons are really the ones who are really pushing against it. Basically, when you get right down to it, it's basically the United States saying, hey, remember that nuclear non-proliferation treaty that we signed way back when? We're going to do that now. Because one of the things in the nuclear non-proliferation treaty, it says that countries have the right to have nuclear arms, right? Like, that's a thing that's okay. You're supposed to encourage it. And when you get these arsenals, you're not supposed to go over certain numbers, and I don't know what they all are. But the United States has been repeatedly violating this treaty by building more nuclear weapons and also trying to stop countries who are supposed to, according to the treaty, have the right to have these weapons from getting them. And even this deal still doesn't do that. It's just a little bit closer in saying, well, you can have a civilian power program. And so basically it's saying, we're going to violate the treaty less, is what the United States government is doing.
Right.
That really
And-
is the summation of it. And also, we're going to stop making life suck so much for the average Iranian.
Right. So, yeah, basically we take all of their toys and we tell them you can have some of your toys back if you agree to our terms, basically where they won't end up having an actual weapon for another 15 years. I mean, they've kicked the can down the road as far as they can, and eventually you're looking at Iran with a nuclear weapon. But other than the propagandized version of history we've all lived through about Iran, they don't really seem to be a problem on anybody's radar except people who are trying to control the world. Those people find them a terrible threat. So
the only thing I ever get from people when I say what are actual bad things that Iran has done to non-Iranians, because to be fair, the government of Iran has been pretty terrible to Iranians.
Yep.
But outside the country, the only thing people can point to is, well, they arm Hamas. It's like, well, what do they give them? Well, I mean, basically they give them rifles. Well, yeah. Okay, I'd prefer that they not give Hamas rifles, all things equal, but ultimately that's a pretty minor thing when you compare it to, say, oh, I don't know, bombing a Pakistani wedding and then swinging back around to kill the ambulance drivers who are trying to help the survivors of your bombing.
And truth be told, I think the Jews are glad that they're giving them rifles, because if all the gun camera footage from all of the Israeli attack helicopters were just mowing down people in the street who didn't have any guns, that'd be really suspect. At least now they have a plausible excuse to just lay out 40 or 50 people because 3 of them had an AK-47. So now they can unleash the hounds.
That may be, although it does get into the whole human shield thing, which I think is a pretty controversial thing. Like, what is the proper voluntarist or libertarian response to the human shield? And Walter Block has this homesteading misery idea, and it's interesting, but I don't know that I buy into it. He says that basically the person who is being used as the human shield has unfortunately taken the misery associated with that. But the problem I have with that is, well, they didn't choose to. That was something that was forced on them.
Uh-huh.
But of course, it was forced on them by the person who was taking them as a human shield, and not by you, who was defending himself against someone who was using a human shield. So still, it's like, well, so if you shoot the human shield because you have to get rid of the guy who's trying to threaten you, does that mean that the guy who is threatening you is the one who is really responsible for the death for the human shield? And I would say probably yes, but even then, it's still kind of... I kind of wonder, if I were in that situation, or there's a guy pointing a gun at me and I have a gun, and he's holding a hostage, what do I do if I have to kill the hostage to save myself? And to be honest, I don't really know.
You see, and that's... If we were talking about nothing but Israeli snipers making some very horrible decisions, then I think that would be a very legitimate talk. But when we're talking about 35 millimeter HEI coming in bursts of 10 and 12 into, marketplaces and outdoor cafes, beaches, pretty much where people tend to gather, just because there's a gunman there really isn't... Well, I mean, if you're not worried about that many casualties, they're worried about political blowback. They could give a damn about the bodies piling up.
Right.
So when we get down to, we have individuals using human shields, I think we can have a very deep philosophical discussion. But as far as chain gun usage in the marketplace, I don't see it as much of a human shield kind of argument.
Yeah, that's definitely true. And I mean, if you come down to the whole, like, who should we favor, Israel or Iran? Well, first my answer is, well, they're both states, so I don't really care. I mean,
yes.
That's the first thing. But the second thing is, while Iran is pretty terrible, I don't remember them using white phosphorus on civilian population areas.
I don't think it... Truth be told, white phosphorus is nasty, but it's not... it's not like a game breaker. Like a 2,000-pound bomb is a hell of a lot worse than white phosphorus. Yeah, white phosphorus will get on you. It's a horrible thing. It causes a lot of smoke. It's nasty gas. It'll burn inside your skin. It's a horrible thing. But the blast radius on a 2,000 pound bomb is like 700 meters. Like at 700 meters, only 50% of the humans that get hit with it are going to survive. Anybody
Meters.
closer than that is done. Meters.
What is Canada? Are we in Canada now?
When I do my blast radius calculations, it's done in meters. God damn it!
No,
So,
I'm American, and I use feet. So multiply that by like 3.
770 yards for those of you, in the deep recesses of the American standard increment system. So all I'm saying is like that's such a powerful blast, and if you've ever seen any pictures of Gaza, I don't think there's any place that you could light off a 2,000 pound bomb in Gaza and not destroy hundreds of lives instantly.
Yeah, I'd agree, and I don't know. I think that really the solution to most of the problems in Israel, first, I don't think there's a statist solution. None of the quote-unquote solutions that any statists have proposed have ever sounded realistic to me. And unfortunately, the solution that I think exists is still not realistic, but because it would require a large portion of both the Palestinian and the Israeli governments, or not governments, but people to become essentially voluntarists. But I think the only solution ultimately is let them buy these things. Like, okay, so the Jews want various, territories to themselves, and the Palestinians want these, and the Muslims want the Temple Mount, and the Jews want the Temple Mount, and even the Iranians are into this whole thing. We'll just let them buy it. Have a bidding contract, have a bidding thing, and whoever bids the highest gets whatever it is, and distribute it. So if the Jews bid the highest for the Temple Mount, then hooray for them. They can go sacrifice bulls in a rebuilt temple. That's great. And all of the people who bid on the Muslim side can get some money back. And if the Muslims win, then terrific. They can pretend that Muhammad went to heaven from Jerusalem on that spot, and they can keep their mosque that misquotes the Quran all over the place. And that's great. They can keep that. And then all the Jews will get a whole bunch of money, and they can build synagogues.
I think if the Jews were interested in that option, they'd have done it in 1948.
Right.
I think if they were interested in purchasing anything there, but if you're going to claim, I have ancestry that's Indian and German, so to think that it's okay for the Jews to just suddenly move back into Israel, and the way they did it, they left the Jews in place, and they essentially killed or forced out all the Palestinians, all the Arabs there.
Yeah.
It's as asinine as me going up to Pennsylvania and declaring that the Susquehanna Valley is mine, and then flying over to Germany and declaring the city of Hamburg mine. It's absolutely asinine kind of thinking, and I don't know where anybody got it that this was ever somehow legitimate, but there it is,
I think one of the problems with my proposed solution of the whole purchasing things is that a lot of these sites that are disputed, from the Muslim perspective, are covered under what's called a waqf, which is an Arabic word that doesn't really have a great translation, but basically it's a kind of a religious endowment. And it's supposed to be perpetual. It's never supposed to go away. Once you put something in this kind of endowment, it's supposed to be used for these religious purposes for all eternity. Or, guess until the Day of Judgment, which is,
never
a big thing in Islam is the Day of Judgment. It's all over the Quran. And so a lot of these buildings and sites are covered by this. And there's actually the which I can remember exactly. It's something like the Al-Quds Waqf administration or something. And it's basically to take care of all these sites in Jerusalem. And so because they're supposed to last for all eternity, they're not really supposed to be open to purchase. And that's one of the problems that my proposed solution will just have people pay money. Just say, I want this X many dollars worth, or whatever. I don't even know what the Israeli currency is. That's one of the problems there, is that there are religious hindrances to the use of money to solve this problem.
Yeah, we're way down a rabbit hole. We're in.
That's true.
We started in Iran. We ended up in Israel.
Well, it really is to some degree connected, because I do think that if Israel weren't so we have to stop Iran no matter what, the United States probably wouldn't care as much, because for some reason, and I know that many of the reasons end up being religious, in ways that I do not agree with, no matter my religious position.
Mhm.
And so it really is connected because the U.S. has been a steadfast ally of Israel no matter what. And
Yeah.
in many instances in which if any other country had done these things, the United States would have just, completely rejected these things.
Yep.
And I mean, not to say that the Palestinians are completely innocent. I mean,
Yeah.
bombing cafes and school buses isn't exactly a great thing to do, but still.
Yeah. Yeah. The ends do not justify the means.
Well, guys, there's a great big connection here between Israel and the way that the United States views the rest of the world, including Iran in this particular instance.
Yeah.
When we talk about what happened with the British Mandate of Palestine, which was a British imperialistic control of the land of Palestine, when we look at what happened there, you have to go back a little further, back to 1917, and recognize what the Balfour Declaration was. It's a very simple declaration where Sir Arthur, where the UK's Foreign Secretary Arthur James Balfour had sent a letter to Walter Rothschild, who was the second Baron Rothschild in England, and asking basically for in 1917. And consider this is 1917. Okay, this is right around the ending of World War II or World War One. And he was basically saying, we want a land for the Jews. Now, behind the scenes, what a lot of people do not know, even if they do know of the Balfour Declaration, which is a very small percentage of the population, is they were offered either Palestine or Argentina, and they chose Palestine.
Which I
Okay,
would understand.
yeah, they chose this because well, this is a holy land, and they all backed it on religious beliefs, etc. Which when we talk about statism, a lot of the statism that we have is derived from religious beliefs, which are simply mythical beliefs passed on from generation to generation, which of course, like statism, is a control of the populace. So we look at the Balfour Declaration and then the Rothschilds, which note that I'm saying that they had put this letter into the second Baron Rothschild, Walter, and they had asked for a land. Okay, and so you look at the institution in 1948 of the United Nations and the establishment of Israel, and everything that tends to endanger or threaten Israel seems to become a big issue in the United States. Okay, now this is a major thing because what else do the Rothschilds have in common in history with what's going on? We've heard you guys talked about the Gaddafi wanting to institute the gold standard. All of a sudden, he becomes a great big enemy. Well, because he wanted to, as JFK did, which ultimately ended in his demise, get off of the international bankers. Okay, so it all tends to flow towards this idea that if you do not deal with the Rothschilds and the banking institutions like the IMF and the World Bank, you will become an enemy. Now, nuclear weapons are just another boogeyman to me. Okay, because let me tell you this. I'm going to give you a list of all the times I've ever been scared of an Iranian nuke. Okay, here it is. Here's number one, and that's the end of my list. That's it. I'm not scared of Iran launching a nuke towards the United States of America.
Yeah.
Okay. However, if you're an Israeli, if you're a Jew who has been transplanted from whatever country you came from, and you came to Israel and you've planted up and you've been there for say 3 generations now, you might be scared. So you're going to pass that fear along to the country, aka the United States, who has the military might and the monetary power to muscle in, especially with the UN when you have a permanent seat. Okay.
Here's the thing: Israel could do that by themselves. They have the. I mean, the last time they got attacked on 3 sides, and they gave those countries back to the people who attacked. They knocked the shit out of them all by themselves.
Yeah.
All by themselves.
They don't
I
need
don't know
that
if
much
I'd
help.
say all by themselves, because they got a lot of financial aid from not only the Rothschild family in England, but also from the United States.
Well, it's true that they did get a lot of aid, but the thing is that it's not like that would change if the United States just said, well, we're not really going to stop Iran. If the United States government said, well, Iran can do whatever it wants, it's not like Israel would suddenly not be able to buy military equipment from the United States. It's not like suddenly they'd be cut off from the IMF.
Yeah.
It's not like all of a sudden they'd be cut off from their own central bank.
I mean,
none of those things would really change.
You've seen it firsthand, man. I mean, not saying that being a soldier is a great thing, but however, if you're working a purely defensive stance, it still pays to have good soldiers, and we've both been to Iraq. Goddamn Arabs are terrible at this. They are terrible. Terrible soldiers.
To be fair, the Iranians
but the Jews are not. The
Arabs.
Jews seem to be bred for it.
To be fair, the Iranians are not Arabs. They don't speak Arabic. They're
right. I
in
understand.
fact, if you call an Iranian an Arab, you have probably insulted him to a pretty high degree. Do not do that.
Yes, you have.
Yes.
I know some Iranians, and do not pretend that they are Arabs. They do not appreciate it.
I was in Basra, so Basra, Iraq is right up against the Iranian border. I had Iraqi Arabs and I had Persians around. Yes, I understand. The point I was making is that you don't really find anybody who's good at warfare. And I understand. I'm not advocating that warfare is a good thing, but if someone decides to come knock down your door, you really don't want the Louisiana Women's Auxiliary showing up to defend you. You want a bunch of Vikings who are coming off of a nasty night of whiskey drinking. That's what you want. And this entire culture, they're just bad at warfare. So as opposed in looking at the Jews are really good at breaking stuff, like really good. To the tune of when Egypt and Jordan and Syria attack them, or Lebanon, they all end up running home. They all end up going home, and Israel is just like, here you go. Here's some of your country back, Egypt. We were going to take the rest, but, you know.
Yeah.
Just in a pragmatic stance, I don't think you can threaten the Jews in conventional warfare and then suddenly think that this is like some sort of credible threat to them.
It's really not. I think it really is. It comes down to they want to be the dominant power in that region.
Right. I liken it to Canada and Mexico trying to attack us. Like it's kind of a punchline. It's not really a feasible scenario.
Yeah. And even if oh, sorry, go ahead, Adrian.
I was going to say they want economic subjugation of these other countries around them.
Yes.
That's the ultimate bottom line as far as I'm concerned and how I see it. Ultimate economic subjugation of their surrounding countries, as they've done to us in the United States.
That makes a lot more sense than anything on the military line of thought.
Yeah. And it really is true that nuclear powers don't go to war. I mean, why would they? That's a terrible idea, because violence is always the highest cost solution to a problem. But if you're not the one who has to pay that cost, then who cares?
Right.
So when a nuclear nation goes to war with a non-nuclear nation, well, the nuclear nation doesn't have to worry too much. The non-nuclear nation isn't going to destroy them. But if two new nuclear nations go to war, well, suddenly that guy who ordered the war, the president or, dictator or chairman or whatever he's called, he has a really good chance of dying in that war. So why would he do it?
Right. Once you go nuclear, no nuclear country has ever been invaded.
Yeah.
Ever. And more to the tune of, if you want to talk about killing off the populations, that's what conventional war is kind of for, but you don't really get the hierarchy involved. A president makes the decision to go to war, but there's almost no chance that he dies in that war. Whereas in a nuclear war, everybody's on the table. Nobody's safe.
And really, that's the reason that the whole United States' stance on assassination confuses me. Like, oh no, we don't do assassination. That's not something that's okay with us. It's like, really? You would rather kill thousands of soldiers and civilians and all these people than kill this one guy who's making these ridiculous decisions. That's what you think is the moral superior thing to do?
Yeah, but
That's insane. That's
think
the
about
exact
that.
opposite of what
That
you should be doing.
No, it's very similar to the nuclear option, because when you're sending other people's children and husbands to die, it's okay. But when you're the one on the menu, and
Right.
that's what assassination is, it's the president basically saying, well, I guess I could be a target too. And that's not how politicians operate.
Right, assassinate. Like, I'm not a huge fan of assassination. Don't get me wrong, but if it comes, war is far worse than assassination. I would much
Right.
rather have every
Right.
last single person who is
Well,
a member of the legislative body of Iran or the mullahs and all those people die from assassination
right.
than have a war with Iran.
Well,
Like, that's just no contest.
and even in ye old hypothetical Ancapistan, I mean, who would you want if you have a neighbor, if you have a statist neighbor threatening the borders of Ancapistan, the property boundaries, I we can't call them borders, but
Well, we can call them
you get the
borders
idea.
in
Would you?
some sense.
What would Ancapistan do if the next door neighbor, if President Obama threatens Ancapistan? Do you think Ancapistan is going to waste their time trying to go to war with America, or do you think they're going to tee up Barack Hussein Obama as have a bounty on his head?
Yeah, just keep
And that
keep
would be
upping the
that.
bounty until he dies, and then he dies
Exactly.
and problem solved.
And then you send a call over to the next guy who's now running the state next door to Ancapistan and say, hey, look, we really don't want a war, but if you want one, you could follow your predecessor, and we could play this game all day. So,
Right.
Well, see, again, we talk about economic subjugation, guys.
Mhm.
War is a big profit industry. It is humongous. It puts us in
Yeah.
debt.
Oh,
It
yeah.
puts us in greater debt to the IMF and the World Bank and the Rothschild banking system, the central banking system that we have in place right now, that has taken over, and is again imperialistic in its own economic nature, again trying to subjugate other nations who refuse to play. Now you look at the countries who refuse to play with the Rothschild banking dynasty, and those are the countries that are on our list: North Korea, Iran, Syria at one point. You guys, these guys, I mean, again, you look at how the powers that be, aka here in the United States, we look at our presidents, and you look at Executive Orders 11905 by Gerald Ford. You look at Executive Order 12333, which banned political assassinations because, and this is my belief. It's difficult to prove this, but it's my belief that it's because they don't want to remove the powers. They want to, again, economically subjugate us into debt while we go to war. And the chattel, aka the population of the countries that go to war, are they mean little to the people in power.
Right.
Okay, and again, economic subjugation is the goal.
Well,
And
sorry, go ahead.
no, go ahead.
Oh, one thing I was going to say is that the population matters, I think, not so much little, but in a way that is not what everyone thinks it is. It's the way that cattle matter to the rancher.
Yes.
Ranchers are really big fans of cattle, but not in a way that the cattle would necessarily prefer them to be really big fans of cattle. It's, the ranchers are there to, kill the cattle, harvest them, use them for their own benefit in a way that is not what the cattle would volunteer for.
Correct.
So,
Right.
these people are big fans of the population, but in a very perverse way.
And I think that's also somewhat the allure of having a state in place. Molly Bear, Stefan Molyneux, who you don't know who Molly Bear is, he makes a really good argument that a state wants to invade another state to have that tax revenue, to have that tax base. So when you have this stateless society next door, what's the real point in trying to get these people into subjugation? Because one, they're stateless. They're not domesticated. So it's going to be a hell of a time. Very much in the same way that people can't invade America, you'd have a hell of a time getting that country. And what are you getting it for? The only thing that's left is resources, because if you know that there's, 40 million people in the country next door, and they have absolutely no intention of becoming your tax slave, and most of them are going to fight to the death, they have to be sitting on a whole large pile of gold or oil or something super important that you're willing to roll that dice with them, because you're not going to get any tangible benefit out of that as a state. It's very hard to sell a war when there's not a whole lot of plunder involved.
Yeah, and even in some cases where states invade other states, it still doesn't always go well. Like when the United States invaded Iraq, what parts of Iraq did they control? Well, ultimately the parts like within eyesight of a soldier who was actively right there on the ground. Outside of that area, they weren't the ones in charge.
Well, they still really weren't in charge. A lot of stuff was on lockdown, but at the same time, I mean, that's what an insurgency is.
But that's the thing.
And they
like,
didn't.
Right now, if the United States, or sorry, if China invaded the United States, right, what parts of the United States would China realistically control? Well, basically only the parts where they physically had soldiers present. Everywhere else, no one would be like, oh, well, we have to kowtow to the Chinese state. Like, no, that's not what would happen. All of the Americans would be like, well, I don't recognize the authority of, you know, the Maoist Chinese government over my city in whatever state or whatever. They would say, no, if there's not a Chinese soldier forcing me to do things at gunpoint, I'm going to not do the things the Chinese government tells me to do.
Yeah.
And so yeah, it's like that, but even more so in an quote unquote Ancapistan, where not only is there that feeling that this particular government doesn't have authority, but the government doesn't even have authority in the first place.
And it's very, very hard to change a culture. Americans can't really go and establish something in the Middle East because there's no way that those people will sit still for us. They'll sit still for their own kind, and they have to believe it's in their own best self-interest. And, you know, you really can't sell that to Iran anymore. Honestly, I think Iran has fought back against America about the only way you can without getting invaded. And they've done it successfully. And that's a bad thing, because when people figure out how Iran did it, they're going to start trying it themselves. And the Americans are running out of way. The federal government is running out of ways to keep its hegemony alive, and that is the overall. I mean, we've only carved up two pieces of a very large pie, but there. I mean, the real problem is we have to start looking at ourselves. That no amount of America bombing you and threatening you, and even economic sanctions, it can't last forever, and some people they'll bite the bullet and they'll wait us out, and they know that we're a ticking time bomb right now.
Yeah,
really empires always fall.
Yes, they do. Mm-hmm. But I think ours is going to fall harder. I think it's going to be a real interesting read 50 years from now in the books.
The problem is in our Prussian education system model that we've run here in the United States, the majority of the population do not consider the United States as an empire. But yeah, you look at the numbers of bases, military bases in foreign countries that we have. You know, consider this. What if Iran had a military base in Birmingham, Alabama?
Yep.
Yeah, I mean, what if they had a military base in Raleigh, North Carolina?
Yeah.
What would the local population see them as? Yeah. Just buddies?
Not friendly.
Yeah.
No.
Well, even if it was Canada, even if it was Alberta, Canada, and Juarez, Mexico, it would still not bode well. And really, I mean, the Renaissance needs to happen in the minds of Americans that we are not the boss. It is not our planet. We cannot treat other people. I mean, if we were to boil this down to, if we were all the countries were kindergartners, we would be that shit-stained kindergarten bully who's always punching people when they wouldn't give up their crayons.
Right.
That's who we are, and a lot of people don't want to admit that. They don't want to have, especially the military guys. It takes a hot minute for somebody to sit back and say, are we really doing a good work here? Are we really being the protectors of the country? Because everybody, tribe, country, border, however you want to slice it, you're going to have that inherent need for protectors. But when you're fighting an aggressive war in somebody else's country, it's a whole different thing. That's not being a protector anymore.
You're being an offender. You're offending people, not defending anything.
Yep.
Right.
that situation, right?
Yeah, and that's one of the things about the Department of Defense. It's not a Department of Defense. It's a Department of Offense. And I'm not the first one to say it, and I don't know who was, but
I was.
you know, oh,
You heard that from Dave, yeah.
okay, fair enough. But
Yeah.
like, yeah, like for instance, when the Black Hawk Down incident, who in America was threatened in that whole situation?
Yep.
Like
Nobody.
nobody.
Not even close.
And yet that was I believe it was Clinton sending military assets off to the middle of this crazy war zone in Africa to go attack people who had threatened absolutely no one in American territory.
Yep.
Well, guys, let me.
No, go ahead.
I want to interject because I've got to share this, guys. And we've only just met, a couple of us here, and I want to say that something came up in 1991 that happened to me personally, and it was during the invasion of Kuwait when we started Desert Storm and the ground troops moved in on day one of the ground war, which lasted like 4 days, the 100-hour war. And what happened was we pulled to the front lines, okay? And I was a young Lance Corporal in the Marine Corps. I was a colonel's driver, okay? I'm not going to say which colonel or what he did, but I was a colonel's driver and bodyguard and gopher and whatever you want to call it, okay? I was his radar, if you remember Radar O'Reilly from MASH. Okay, so I was radar to this colonel. And this colonel...
Did you have a teddy bear too?
Huh?
Did you have a teddy bear too?
No, I did not have a teddy bear. So I wasn't completely like radar, but this is what I did. I served in that capacity. I was this colonel's go-to guy. He wanted something done. I went and did it. Well, we went to the front lines, which we were on the front lines the entire time. I was with the 2nd Marine Division headquarters, and we moved up. Every time we moved up with the 2nd Marines, and 8th Marines and 10th Marines were behind us with their artillery and things like that. But we were on the front lines, okay? I spent the entire time over there except for 4 days on the front lines, and that's a completely different story as to those 4 days. But when we moved up into Kuwait, I remember going to the front, to the very edge of what we called the blue zone, which was a zone that was cleared of mines. Because if you guys remember, there was a 2-mile wide strip around Kuwait that was supposedly planted with mines. It was mined. So what the combat engineers did from the 2nd Marine Division and the Army did was they went and cleared lanes for us to go into Kuwait. Okay, once these lanes were cleared, then we moved in through those lanes and basically invaded Kuwait, a counter invasion of Kuwait. Okay, so I go up to the front lines on the first day, and I'm standing there waiting. We had a moment to kind of get out and stretch our legs from the Humvees, etc. And I see all these Army guys running around. Okay, now, this is extremely important because this is something that affects everybody in the world. Okay, pay close attention to what I'm getting ready to say, because what I did was I asked one of these Army guys, "What do you do?" And they said, this one guy turns to me and says, "Well, we're PSYOPS." And I said, "Well, what's PSYOPS?" He said, "Well, it's psychological operations." I said, "Well, what do you guys do?" He said, "Well, you've seen the canisters laying on the ground made of aluminum where they've been exploded, but they didn't actually catch on fire. They've planted all these flyers out over the enemy troops." And I said, "Yeah." They said, "Well, that's what we do. We psychologically get to the enemy." Okay. And I remember pulling up all these flyers off the ground because they were everywhere across the desert in Kuwait. They put them over the Iraqi troops, a little flyer saying, "Here's the date that we're coming, and you better get ready because we're coming, and you need to give up to us and not fight." Okay. Again, a subjugation technique. Okay. Now, why is this important? Is because psychological operations is something that's very much glossed over when talking about history. Okay. They might talk about it, but they never tell you what it's called. It's called a psychological operation where they control the mindset of the enemy or the people they want to subjugate. Okay. And whether those subjects are economic subjects or militaristic subjects, they want to subjugate those people, and they start by getting to their mind, because dead people don't pay taxes. Okay, and again, I'm tying this right back into
Well,
economic
they do
subjugation.
in some cases. There is the estate tax.
That's true,
A
but
goddamn lot of them vote. Jesus.
they only do it once, though.
That's
Yeah.
that's generally true. They do only pay taxes once.
Right. So, do you want 100% of what this guy's worth today, or do you want 10% every year of what he's worth for the next 50 years?
Right.
Well, that's 5 times the amount. So a live guy under subjugation of taxation is worth a hell of a lot more than the guy who's just died, because now not only do you get to take his stuff, but now you have to defend his stuff, whatever you've taken from him. So again, the psychological operations, I looked into it later and discovered that 75%, this is back in the 1990s, 75% of the psychological operations guys in the U.S. Army, it was a 4th PSYOPS brigade, if I remember correctly, 75% of them were reservists, and most of them worked in the U.S. media. Okay? They worked in the media, and then when they were called to war, they went and worked for PSYOPS. So they were very prepared to establish stories in the media that would bend the will of the majority who believed what they saw in the media. In the U.S. media, in the world media, are all fed from very few outlets, okay, like Reuters and Knight Ridder. These guys have control of information, and they feed this information to the news outlets like Fox and CNN. They all draw off the same news wires. This is all psychological operations. Okay, consider the fact that when you say, well, I know what's going on in Iran, you don't.
Yep.
Because
Yeah,
what they're passing along the wires is not classified information. So any citizen in the world who thinks they're getting the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth is deluding themselves, because we have a classification system over information. And when I was in the Marine Corps for 4.5 years, I had a NATO top secret clearance because I worked in
only managed secret.
communications.
Yeah.
Say again?
I said I only managed secret clearance.
Right. And the top secret clearance is very difficult to get. Okay. And it took a year to get that for me. And once I did it, it was like a sentence. It was like a prison sentence.
Yep.
And I couldn't wait to just get away from all that. So when I got out of the Marine Corps, that was like a big weight off my back. But what I realized was that the classification system keeps information of a military essence away from the public. And they give you this glossed over version of what they want you to know or think. Okay? So psychological operations twist these things to bend the will of the people, to keep us in, again, subjugation, which always boils down to economic subjugation yet again. So, it was a very, very important lesson for me that happened empirically to me, that I understood that there are people whose jobs are solely to get me to believe something. Now, when we talk about Iran, they want to make Iran the bad guy. Okay, let's go back to something. When I think about Iran, I remember how they questioned the Holocaust. Okay, now I come from a background of being raised as a Jehovah's Witness. Okay, and my mother finally broke free from them years ago. But the Jehovah's Witnesses are a Christian religion. And there are several religions out there that are Christian religions. And the Christians seem to hold the Jews in high esteem. And again, we go back to Israel and quite specifically the Zionists, who are all tied into the economic elite of the world. Okay. So we have to take all these things into consideration and consider that the information that we receive is filtered and owned by these people, and is only given to us in such a way that we feel like we're the good guys and they're the bad guys. Okay. And I'm sorry, I know I've strayed a little bit. I've digressed a bit here, but I felt like that was worth throwing in there, because it's one of those things when you take in information, you have to consider the source and consider where those sources are getting their information. Who's the source of the source?
Yep.
Okay.
Well,
and why would they do it?
It's actually a really beautiful point you bring up, because this was really, really solid for a long time, and why things have been so much worse in the last couple of years. And by worse, I mean better, but you see a lot more discord amongst people is because the internet is acting very much how the printing press acted a long time ago, and these normal channels of information are being subverted. It's a whole workaround where actual information tends to come there's at least a way to get it from the source. So a lot of this stuff, we find out Iran's side of the deal the same day we find out the propagandized version. And now it's to the point where I don't even have cable anymore. There is no reason for me to watch CNN, Fox, MSNBC, ABC, CBS. There is absolutely no reason to let those people into my head ever, because I've seen the news come from the other side of the coin 10
Amen.
minutes before it. And it's just like, yeah, I'm done. You're not even worth the bill.
Amen. I've been 11 years without U.S. media, foreign media, any media coming into my head except for social media.
Yep.
And my education has gone through the roof.
Yep. I'm not 11 years. I'm only about 3. I'm about 3. I had cable, but I didn't rely on it much. I kind of looked at this as the good thing is, if you're really interested, you go to Fox or CNN and you see what they're reporting about, and then you know what to Google search. And then you go to Google and you find out 3 other people tell you, yeah, not only are they lying, but here's what the actual story is, and this is what you really need to know. So, if anything, they're just a way to spot the issue, but they're going to give you a lie straight up, and you don't have to read the article, just the headline.
Right.
Yeah. It really is the case that, every once in a while I do read an article just to know what everyone else is thinking about this thing. But the chances of me just going with whatever I've read is almost zero. I'm always going to, if it's something I care about, I'm going to dig deeper. Yep. Because whatever article I'm reading from a news source is going to be superficial at best.
Yep.
I call it red herring media.
That's a good one. I like that.
That's pretty good.
Yeah,
that's actually pretty good.
I really do like that.
All right, guys. I think we've ripped this situation up fairly well for the week, giving you something to think about. Definitely not all inclusive, because these larger topics tend to be very nebulous. There's more to it. There are more dimensions. There are different facets. This is not all encompassing, but if you didn't learn anything today, feel free to hit me up, Donnie Giebert on Facebook, and tell me I'm a worthless prick. If you did learn anything, swing by any of the resources mentioned at the beginning, and tune in next week. We will have something interesting for you then too. Thanks for coming tonight, guys. I know it was kind of short notice, and next week, yeah, plug your stuff and go ahead, plug your stuff.
I don't have a whole lot to plug. I do occasional freelance CGI, so if you have any particular need for that, you can hit me up, Timothy Judge. I'm on Facebook. If you're listening to this podcast, there's a fair chance you're in one of the Facebook groups that I'm a part of, like the Seas of Liberty podcast. I'm thinking about starting a more regular web presence for voluntarism, but right now that's not currently a thing I'm doing. So go ahead, Adrian.
Well, you can join me in the voluntarist ministry, which is simply, and it is the introductory stage of introducing people of libertarian mindset or et cetera into the idea of voluntarism. It is that first step. So voluntarist ministry is the group on Facebook. It is my baby, and it is there to introduce people to voluntarism, and it branches off from there. There's a great deeper idea behind voluntarism that I refuse to mention, because once you get it, you get it. But if you haven't gotten it yet, you might come and get it, because it's good for you.
All right, guys, tune in next week. You can get all of our stuff on theseedsofliberty.com. Also on Facebook, iTunes, Twitter, and Stitcher. And next week, Lloyd will be back, and not exactly sure what we're doing yet, but it'll be good. So tune in. Thanks.